All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today in this webinar. We're very happy to have you. My name is Paige Cowie, and I'm a program manager within the Office of Global Programs at USDA's Foreign Agricultural Service. We're very excited for our partner, Agribusiness Associates, to share their recent work developing and updating a step-by-step toolkit for reducing food loss and waste throughout agricultural value chains. I'll share more detail about our program for today, but before we begin, we can start with some housekeeping items, if that's all right. So please keep yourself muted throughout the presentation. We will have a Q&A session at the end, and if time allows, we can open that up to video discussion. This webinar is being recorded. A link to the recording will be shared afterwards by email, and it will be available on a climate linked site where other resources that you'll be learning about today will also be available. As the presentation is going on, please put your questions, any questions you may have in the chat, and we'll try to get to all of them during the question and answer session at the end. This webinar is scheduled for 75 minutes, so if you know you have to leave around 11 but have a question, please try and indicate that when you're putting it in the chat so we can try to prioritize those before others who may be able to stay longer. So I will go through our agenda for today. I'll start off our program by setting the stage with a short introduction regarding the background of this project, recapping what was done in phase 1 in 2020 and the objectives of the phase 2 work that was done this past year. Then I'll hand it off to the experts at Agribusiness Associates to get further into the details of their work, including a presentation on the updated guide and the experience of piloting it in Kenya and Costa Rica. After that, we'll open it up to discussion in a Q&A session before we close. Before I start, though, I'd like to put in a plug for 2 other USDA-sponsored food loss and waste webinars that I've been jointly organizing with Dr. Jean Busby, the department's food loss and waste liaison. I will drop those links in the chat so you can put them on your calendars. On October 19th, we'll be hosting a webinar to share international perspectives and success stories of food loss and waste policy and program initiatives from countries such as Denmark, South Korea, Rwanda, Chile, Peru, and the US. And on November 2nd, we are co-hosting a webinar with the FAO North America Liaison Office. This one will be focused on municipal scale food loss and waste reduction efforts and policy implementation in US and Canadian cities. So we hope to see you there. And with that, I'll start with little context. So we started this project in 2020 in conjunction with colleagues in USAID's Office of Global Climate Change and Agribusiness Associates Incorporated, who is an international development consulting firm that focuses on overcoming some of the biggest challenges in the agriculture sector. The challenge that the FAS and USAID team were interested in researching at the time was that of food loss and waste within agricultural value chains. We got connected with Agribusiness Associates because of their expertise in this field, and we worked to further narrow our research question on this project to look at which value chains should one invest in to reduce food loss and waste for the greatest impact. There are many obvious benefits to reducing food loss and waste, of course, including increased efficiency of food production and use of production inputs, improved nutrition, and perhaps most importantly, reduced greenhouse gas emissions from wasted food that's left to rot in landfills or elsewhere. As we are all well aware, agricultural production is a leading contributor of global greenhouse gas emissions. In 2021, FAO came out with new data showing that food systems at large, including everything from production to the end of the value chain, contribute up to 1/3 of global greenhouse gas emissions. Of course, we want the data for emissions at large to be downward trending, and so food loss and waste represents a large opportunity to fix a relatively solvable problem, though not without its challenges. In phase 1 of this project, Agribusiness Associates developed actionable knowledge products that can be used by various stakeholders to enable greater investments in food loss and waste. The output of the 2020 project included the Food Loss and Waste Value Chain Selection Guide that we'll be learning more about today. This guide is a user-friendly toolkit to identify and assess high-impact opportunities to reduce post-harvest food loss and waste along the value chain. Doing so allows for greater and more targeted interventions and investment in a value chain to mitigate the loss exactly where it's happening. Stakeholders that would find this guide useful could really be anyone or institution interested in prioritizing and integrating food loss and waste mitigation in their work, such as project development implementers or even policymakers. During phase one, Agribusiness Associates also developed case studies that characterize and explore key factors that drive food loss and waste, using examples from Tanzania, Rwanda, Cameroon, and India as well. All of the deliverables and recordings of webinars that were conducted in phase one are available on a Climate Link site that we can share with you today. So this past year, USDA and Agribusiness Associates entered into a second phase of the project to put the food loss and waste value chain selection guide to test in the field. The guide was piloted in Kenya and Costa Rica, which afforded us the opportunity to gain new insights from implementation and best practices for facilitating and replicating the process elsewhere. Agribusiness Associates has updated the guide, which will be presented to you today. They have developed several other accompanying resources, such as data collection templates and guidelines to walk stakeholders through the process of how to conduct their own assessments in the context of their own work using the materials that this project has developed. So I'm very excited for Agribusiness Associates to share the results of their work with you today. And without further ado, I'd like to hand things off to Rashmi Eka, a food loss and waste project director at Agribusiness Associates. Rashmi?
Good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for that page. So I'm Rashmi, and we're very excited to unveil the second edition of this guide. If you've seen that first one, we've built it out quite a bit and operationalized it, by which I mean that it comes with an 18-piece toolkit, and it has PowerPoints and Excel sheets and different templates, which are really easy to fill out and handy for leading workshops and doing the data collection so that you can easily walk through the selection process. Like Paige mentioned, we've tested out the toolkit in two different contexts. First in Kenya, where we made some improvements, and then we tested it out again in Costa Rica and again made some improvements. So it's really been through an iterative process with several stakeholders, and it's worked well in different geographies with different crops and different types of institutions. So the main purpose of the guide is really to help users incorporate food loss and waste considerations while selecting priority crops. This is really important for sustainability. As Paige mentioned, global food loss and waste is responsible for a large part of human-caused greenhouse gas emissions. The process is very thoughtful, as it will really guide your team to understand more about food loss and waste in the crops under consideration. There's a lot of listening and learning activities built in, which will help you gain a better understanding and design a more responsive project. Lastly, it's an investment decision tool, so it helps identify where you'll get the most bang for your buck, for your food loss and waste buck. So this is kind of the meat of it. I would say we have a 5-step selection process. You will need a facilitator who can shepherd the organization through the whole process. They can be an external or an internal food loss and waste expert. So starting from the first phase, which is planning. Planning is really important because it includes scheduling and identifying resources, both human and financial, who will participate, and what the budget is, and just get everything on people's calendar. And we find that the planning stage, the more time that you take to do it, the better the execution is. Second is framing the food loss and waste objective. This helps in understanding how food loss and waste aligns with the overall mandate of the organization and find places for synergies. If food loss and waste is new to an organization, it drills home the point that it's an essential part of what we do in agriculture. And now, it has to be more explicit because it's a specific problem that needs to be solved. Once the objectives are identified, it becomes easier to understand what types of criteria and indicators are important and align with those objectives of the organization. The third phase is identifying and prioritizing the value chains. So, what we do is we finalize our criteria and our indicators, and then we draw up a list of promising value chains. And then we go through the indicators and see how the crops rank on these different indicators. We have a Excel sheet tool for this, as we call it, the prioritization matrix. So you can just like fill it out and you rank the crops according to your priorities. Fourth is data collection. So you go out to the field and collect data to ground your understanding of the various indicators from the prioritization matrix. We fill in key gaps in our understanding over here and essentially make sure that the crops that you have, who kind of reached the top of the ranking, those are the ones that really need the food loss and waste investment. And the fifth phase, we come back home, we look at everything we've got, and then we go into a validation workshop. This we typically call both internal and external stakeholders and share our findings and seek to build buy-in for the selected crops. We have a few different ways in which we've done the validation workshop that both Julie, who will present in Kenya, and Laura, who will present on Costa Rica, will share. So this is an overview. I quickly want to show you some of the tools we have for each of these phases. So phase one, this is the planning. So here's like a planning tool where we have a stakeholder checklist. So we have different groups, and then people can identify the different human resources that you need. This is another planning tool, which is for scheduling. We have days and locations, and the how much time you would need per activity. This is really handy. This is a food loss and waste background presentation with an audio layover over it. We have it uploaded on YouTube. It's a short presentation that everybody can, who's involved in the selection exercise, can watch so that they can build their knowledge of food loss and waste, understand the main terms and their definitions, the context, how big of a problem it is, some of the causes and drivers. It's really just like a handy primer so that the whole team has the same language and understanding to go into this work. A lot of what we've presented here is borrowed from FAO and WRI's work in food loss and waste. Phase two is to frame the food loss and waste objective. And that's done in a workshop. And once you've framed the objectives, we go into selecting the prioritization criteria. So this is the same as from the original guide. We've laid out 12 different criteria. These are the ones that were most relevant to food loss and waste. But as we've done the pilots, we've seen that organizations do come up with their own criteria as well. So it's totally flexible and open to that. We have here food loss, food waste, economic outcomes, food security and nutrition, climate vulnerability, carbon footprint, water footprint, land footprint, wildlife and biodiversity, gender, youth, and investment opportunity. And for each of these criteria, in the guide, you'll have guiding questions. These can be used in focus groups or in a workshop to, walk through, like for every crop, you can answer these questions, and it'll give you the kind of the most important information you need to understand food loss for that crop. And then we have suggested indicators and sources of data for those indicators. So we have this for the 12 criteria. In phase 3, we do the prioritizing of the value chains, and this is what the matrix looks like. We'll show you how the matrix looks like when it's filled out, but just over here, the crops go along the left-hand column, and the criteria goes along the top and with the indicators. And then you fill out all of the orange section with different scorings for the crops. And then you can use, green for if you have like high quality data with good fidelity that you can trust, and then red where it's more of an educated guess. Phase 4 is data collection. We've realized that the data collection piece actually is the most variable in terms of how much time and money you have to do it. And we've offered a few different ways in which you can collect data, and institutions can kind of pick and choose, as with the constraint of resources they have, how much they can do it. But we've provided guidance on how to do field observations and do a value chain photo story. For us, an expert observation of food loss and waste is where we can really see, why and how and where food loss is happening. Next is field measurements or load tracking. We've provided guidance on how to measure loss. This is not a full food loss and waste measurements. This is, we really just do 1 to 4 reps or samples, visit a couple different farmers or retailers, and see how the loss is happening and how much. We have a focus group discussion guide with the guided way of doing value chain mapping, and again, seeing where in the value chain map the losses are happening. And then we've offered guides for semi-structured interviews, again, of farmers and vendors. And lastly, we have the validation workshop. In this workshop, as I said, you bring in your internal and external stakeholders and share your findings. And it's also, with the expertise of the group, you can ground your findings by really leveraging the information in the room. You can crowdsource any remaining gaps in the data. We find this session very important for building buy-in for the selected value chains and brainstorming interventions. So with that was kind of the overview of the 5-stage process. I'm going to hand it over to Julie, who will explain how we went through these 5 stages in Kenya and what we learned from our experience there. Over to you, Julie.
Awesome. Thank you, Rajmi. Good morning, everybody from the West Coast. My name is Julie Shuck. I've worked with Agribusiness Associates for a few years now, and in the past year, have been working to help build out the guide that Rajmi developed last year with the toolkits. So I'm interested in showing what this looks like in Kenya. So if you want to go to the next slide. USDA did some great facilitation and helped connect us with the Fresh Produce Consortium of Kenya. This is an export market association. And so basically what they do is they have their members and they really try to ensure that Kenyan products are getting into European and Middle Eastern markets. So they work as liaisons. And they also try to address issues such as rejections. So they did a study in 2019, and they found out that one of the greatest reasons for Kenyan products getting rejected was the use of a chemical spray that's banned in the European Union. So from there, they were able to get their members together and do trainings. And so now they've greatly reduced that kind of impact, which is great because that's also already like a built-in food loss waste aspect. So I got to work with a core team. So FPC, especially when it's really interesting. So when we work with the Fresh Produce Consortium of Kenya, we worked with an export association, and then working in Kenya, we worked with the government. So we see a bit of differences. And one of them was that FPC had a nice core team. And so we had a handful of people that we relied on for a lot of institutional memory. Diana Nduku was the food loss waste lead for the team. And we also worked with Patience Katana, and Purity Moini, which were fabulous. I'm also going to share some overarching tips of kind of some of the big things we learned as we piloted and made adjustments. And I think as we've noticed, it's a pretty comprehensive, it's an 18-piece toolkit. And so really, especially from the facilitator's perspective, just going through the toolkit and kind of testing it out just to make sure you kind of understand the flow is pretty important. So go ahead and pick a couple of crops that you think will be of interest and you can kind of practice it, and that can help with facilitation. And also having plenty of time to plan for a process. A lot of people can set aside the time if they have enough advanced warning. And so doing that. And another lesson learned in terms of planning and organizing is scheduling things so that you're doing the data collection at the time of harvest. So you'll see coming up that we weren't able to look at one value chain because of seasonality. But if you have more time to run a study, you can kind of have more flexibility there. Next slide, please. Next, moving on to the framing of the food loss waste objective. This starts as a PowerPoint presentation and is one of the most intuitive pieces. So you can kind of fill in the PowerPoint as is and go through it. And so what it really does is at first it asks you, just as an organization, what are your strengths? What are your priorities? And so then you start to go ahead and connect food loss waste with what you're already doing. And so what we see is when we talk about food loss and waste, a lot of us working in agriculture are already looking at kind of increasing yields. And the other side of that coin is looking at reducing food loss and waste to keep those profits and gains in the system. And so sometimes it's a little bit of approaching your work slightly differently, or in some cases like FPCs where they address the issue of sprays causing rejections. You also see how sometimes you're already doing food loss and waste work. It's just kind of using a bit of a different language or a different lens, but you're still kind of contributing, which is kind of fun to see as well. The objective they developed was to have food loss and waste from farm to fork by 2030 and the targeted value chains specifically for FPC Kenya members. The targeted value chains being those that would rise to the top after going through this exercise. And then as an organization, one of their goals is to drive growth for their members, but the bigger picture of driving growth for their members is to drive growth within Kenya. They want to be a part of the process that helps increase Kenyan GDP, as well as nutrition and food security. So to those end, they see Kenya as producing high quality food and efficient systems. And they want to do this by leveraging their current strengths of doing trainings to members in different agriculture groups and doing value chain partnerships. One thing of interest they do now is when they have an issue in the industry, they go ahead and they start to liaison and they get people together so the industry themselves can start to tackle these issues, as well as taking some of those experiences and lessons learned to help develop policy for the country. Next slide, please. So these were next we get into the identifying and prioritizing value chains. So the first thing they did was they started to identify what was of most interest. For this activity, they wanted to look at one import and one export market. So one domestic and one for export, which was really fascinating because it gave us a lot to kind of compare and understand as well. So from that, they went ahead and picked some foods that were really popular for the Kenyan diet, such as avocado, tomato, cabbage, mango. And then they knew their members also did snap peas and fine beans. Fine beans are also green beans for export. And then they talked to one of their members who was participating in the study, and they also wanted us to add thyme and basil. And you can see this is kind of an abbreviated glimpse of it, but we started to collect basic data once you know what value chains you're interested in to start to understand what's the scale in terms of economics, in terms of how much is going to impact your population, and then start to see what do we already know about food loss and waste in this area. And so you'll see, for example, mango has 44% food loss highlighted in green. That means we found a study that's pretty specific to Kenya and it's relatively recent. So it's something we can really count on. The other numbers were kind of estimates. They might not have been for the area. They might be feel a little bit out of date, or they know there's a lot of context changes, for example, in avocado in the industry. So not really feeling like those are the most reliable to make hard decisions on, but really fascinating. We also learned that there just isn't a lot of information for thyme or basil in general. So herbs are really hard to kind of find some food loss and waste information on, which was interesting. Next slide, Jasmine. So I'll go through the top of these boxes. So what they chose for their criteria was economic outcomes, food and nutrition security, investment opportunities, gender, youth, and carbon footprint. From there, we started to drill. And again, these are really aligned with their organization's overarching goals. And so from there, we kind of discussed what are the indicators we want to use. So for economics, they looked at the value of food loss waste per kg and ended up giving this a weighting of 30%. 30% because economic growth is one of the main indicators they have for their own members being successful, but again, contributing to the greater Kenyan context. So those two were aligned well in that. And then food security, a lot to do with what are the different roles that FPC has in working in the country. And for this, they wanted to look at what percentage of the Kenyan diet does this food make up, as well as its nutritional level. And so now you can start to see where you can have really hard numbers, or you can kind of do some a little bit subjective, but like really good estimates. So for example, you see cabbage. Cabbage isn't necessarily a super high nutrition food, but it's on Kenyans' plates most days of the week. And so it's really important as a staple food to really acknowledge its role. Then we look at investment opportunities. This is one where they decided to make their own indicator. For this, we looked at their members' willingness to invest. So again, kind of focusing on those actors they had the greatest access to. And that's where you see like cabbage starting to drop off. Cabbage is a staple crop, but it's not incredibly profitable compared to some of the others like mango or avocado. Looking at gender, which for them was really kind of focusing on the role of women. We wanted to look at employment and entrepreneurship opportunities. So during the process, this was kind of understanding what roles do women play at different stages of the value chain and what income do they earn compared to men. And then we looked at youth, and youth I thought was interesting is because for youth is anybody 18 to 35 and really looking at how to engage them. And they wanted this to be opportunities for technology because those are some of the things that draw in youth. And so when you get things like mango and avocado, those were exciting. Then you see cabbage. Cabbage is a standard crop. It's not that exciting. Whereas for women are more likely to want to engage with cabbage because they know how important it is to provide that regularly. And then you get things like thyme and basil. They ranked pretty high in this because they're newer, so there's more opportunities for entering the market, but also they have a short life cycle. And so that also can appeal to youth as a quick turnaround. And then we looked at carbon footprint for a role in the environment and greenhouse gases. I think, yeah, the tip at the bottom talks about including somebody in the process, ideally the facilitator, but somebody on the team would be great as well. If you're an NGO, having your monitoring and evaluation specialist or a statistician, but somebody who kind of has some experience with taking criteria and developing indicators. And we've outlined those in the guiding questions, but again, you can kind of make your own and how do you decide and track those for yourself. And then on the next slide, you can see we've highlighted that we ended up going with the 3rd and 4th ranked value chains, tomatoes and fine beans or green beans. Part of that is because, like we mentioned earlier with timing for harvest, avocado were not in season at the time, so we knew we would get rough guesses. So we decided to start looking at the other 3. And one of the first places we visited was a pack house. And what we saw was mangoes have such a high demand abroad and domestically that there was little to no loss because you were able either to send it to Europe that had the most stringent markets, or you could go to the Middle East with slightly stringent. And then if it didn't meet any of those requirements, then the local traders would come to the plant. And so because the goal again was to help FPC's members increase efficiency, we saw greater loss in tomatoes and fine beans and went with those value chains for investigation. Next slide. So for data collection, this gives some idea of the green beans, the pack house we saw at the top, as well as some of our field visits. And I think I want to take this time to emphasize because it's tricky with the data collection because like Rajmi mentioned before, this isn't a full-blown food loss waste assessment. That's not necessarily the goal of you don't need to do that for 9 or 10 value chains to select one. It's kind of just to get nice estimates. But what it really does is it also gives people a really good understanding of what that value chain looks like and really start to internalize where some of those losses are occurring and why. So our goal here was to pilot the process and kind of in exchange help capacitate those that partnered with us for this study in some of these field research methods. So how do you kind of do a little bit of estimating of loss and how much gets left behind? I do want to emphasize this throughout, is that we used a case study approach. I'm using case study approach just to mean we didn't have a lot of reps. So we really focused on doing like expert observations and really where in the value chain are we seeing losses and why, versus having really strong quantifying numbers. So we do have some numbers and estimates to help people, to help with the selection, but this is not scalable. It was kind of, we did single observations. And again, we worked with FPC members. FPC members are exporters, and so they tend to be medium, larger size farms. So we're not necessarily talking about smallholder farmers in these instances. And the next slide show a little bit of the work we did with tomatoes as well. We got to go to a greenhouse as well as open field tomatoes, doing some different field loss estimate measurements, and then pack houses and interviews. And thank you. So we'll go ahead and show you briefly what this ended up looking like. So working with FPC on how we wanted to manage the data and put everything together. So we took a value chain map, and we see that with tomatoes, they average about, yield about 24 tons of tomatoes per acre in a year. During that time when they're sorting or grading on the farm, about 10% get rejected, and they left that in that instance in the field as green manure. From there, it goes to the pack house where there's another level of sorting and grading going on. And we were able to talk to the pack house, and they said they have about a 21% rejection rate. And how that specific pack house does it is the farmer comes, brings their tomatoes, and right then and there, the pack house inspects it and says if we're taking it or not. And if they take it, they pay them. If not, they go ahead and give it back, and then that farmer will go ahead and take it to a local market. So tomatoes are really popular, and they're a major part of the Kenyan diet. So there's a lot of alternative markets. When you go to the local market, we interviewed some vendors, and we averaged about 7% loss. When you go to a retail, such as the supermarket, you see about 10% loss. And a lot of this is people picking it up to check it and maybe bruising it along the way, or if it busts open and leaks everywhere, that's kind of what you see going away. And then anything that gets thrown away from the supermarket onward ends up in a landfill. And when we interviewed consumers and we surveyed them, we found that about 23% of the tomatoes they purchase end up having to go into the trash. So of the total production of tomatoes that we saw, 81% makes it to the consumer. And then from the consumer onwards, you have just shy of a 25% loss. Next slide. And so here's a few key data analysis insights. And one of the reasons I underline data analysis is really important because this is a little bit research based, and there's going to need to be some data analysis. So also taking the time to plan that into the schedule, and also make sure those skills are there or can be brought in for the project, because there's a lot of great opportunities to gather information, but how are we putting that together to help tell a story? So from the food loss aspect, which food loss occurs from the point of the farm till about the point of retail or the restaurant. And so from that point, we really noticed that the variety, the seed variety of the crop has a massive impact on food loss and waste. So if seeds aren't necessarily produced specifically for some of the Kenyan environments that were brought from other areas, you may consistently see losses that were out of the control of the producers to begin with. Also, a very common issue is a lot of seasonality. A lot of farmers depend on rain-fed agriculture. And so then when you depend on rain-fed, everybody kind of plants at a similar time and then harvest at a similar time. And then you end up seeing a massive glut in the market, so that you often see food not even leaving the field for many farmers that can't find contracts. And then also acknowledging the climate and climate fluctuations and how those can impact the availability of food as well. We also see that food loss tends to be really high for export markets. And again, we were kind of comparing the green beans with the tomatoes in this instance, but part of it is your international markets may have higher standards than the local markets. And part of it too is just packaging. So if the package you're given is a little square, you have to cut off the ends of the green beans. They're completely safe, they're completely edible, but they don't fit the packaging, so they end up becoming a piece of waste. And then you also have the impact of local consumption. So like we said, mango was either going to go to Europe or the Middle East, or it ends up in a local market, so you don't see a lot sorted and graded out at that point in time. Whereas with green beans, if they bring them in and they get rejected, green beans just aren't as big a part of the Kenyan diet. When we did the survey of consumers, only one person said they purchased it for the children that they cooked for. Nobody else really deals with it much. So when the green beans get rejected from the pack house, they're shipped back to the farmer. And then by that point in time, it usually goes into something like a green manure or an animal feed if it hasn't spoiled by that point. And then drawing on some of the vendor and consumer waste surveys, we talked about damages coming from quality checks of small bruises. So one of the cool things we saw was we interviewed one vendor and she was like, yeah, I have all these losses because it squeezed. And then the survey was like, oh, some of the other vendors, like they select it for the consumers, and the vendor instantly started changing the way that she sold her tomatoes to reduce loss. At home storage, one respondent mentioned losing electricity, and so then all the food in the refrigerator went bad. Food preferences that of how much you end up enjoying the food you cook, or maybe you prepare something and you can't consume it all. Food preparation. So in a lot of instances, people might have cooked with half of a tomato and then you never end up getting back to half of the tomato. So it was interesting. It wasn't like, oh, I buy 5 tomatoes and 1 or 2 goes bad. Sometimes it was like in the past week, I bought 2 kgs and half of the tomato got left behind because it went bad before we could get to it. And then menu changes. You know, I think I'm going to go home. I'm going to make a pasta tonight. Something else happens. I do takeout, and then I'm not able to prepare the food. Next slide. And then we wrapped up with the validation workshop, presenting these findings there. At this event, we had stakeholders that were farmers, government, non-governmental organizations, and other associations and value chains to kind of have a cross learning where we had this experience. And then individually, ABA with the pilot partner with FPC, we had a debrief of the event and the process and how that went. What we realized is FPC has like a smaller staff and a more concerted organization. So you're working with individuals and you're able to instill a lot of institutional knowledge. But we recognize that as we moved into Costa Rica, we were going to be dealing with a larger group of people. And also there was a change in government as we were coming through. And we wanted to ensure that the work that we were starting at the tail end of the old government was still available and accessible to the new government. So we developed a more formal collaborating, learning, and adapting workshop using USAID's guidance. And then we could use that in Costa Rica to work with new government officials and help them understand what we've been doing and start engaging them in the process. And with the whole goal of really focusing at this point of where is it that we can invest to have food loss waste reduction interventions, and what are those next steps? And so next, I would like to pass this off to Laura Brenes Peralta. She was our consultant in Costa Rica and was a fabulous food loss waste expert. She helped create some of the data collection tools that have made it into the final toolkit. So she really had some great insights and experience to add to this project, as well as working with Eva Vargas as well. So thank you, Laura, and I'll go ahead and pass it off to you.
Thank you, Julia, and hello to everyone. Thank you for having me this morning, and of course for being able to share this experience of the pilot in Costa Rica. So if we go to the next slide, please. And the next one, besides, of course, acknowledging my colleague Eva Vargas, because of her participation during this workshop, I wanted to get started pointing out that the main partner for this pilot was the Ministry of Agriculture and Livestock in our country, especially dedicated to the Caribbean region. In this case, the pilot did not have a national scope or a specific private organization scope, but a regional one led by a public institution like the ministry that has very specific interests in working with small, medium-sized farmers, and also addressing food losses and waste as a potential solution even to address some other issues that are going on in the region, for example, the poverty rate that is there. So the core team was integrated by members of the ministry, Yendri and Francini, and of course of a bunch of wonderful extension agents collaborated with us throughout the whole 2 weeks of the pilot. So we also want to acknowledge their support on this. In the next slide, I wanted to show you a little bit about the objectives that led the complete process. So this was, of course, part of the suggestions in the guide. So as a second step, we had a framing objective session in which working especially with the core members, we were able to define that the goal was going to be the prioritization of value chains in the Caribbean region by exploring the main factors that were causing food losses and waste in order to inform future reduction strategies that would come to improve the economic and environmental conditions. By doing these, MAG members were very clear as they began sharing with us some of their insights and their experiences that they wanted to focus their strategy mostly on value adding. And through that, they would consider also some previous steps taken by the institution that does research and extension in Costa Rica, like INTA, also working together with universities, increasing awareness and developing different tools or elements such as manuals or doing some value chain planning. One interesting thing that we tried to do here, because of the number of people we were having, was considering the use of different tools. So for example, the value chain selection guide allowed us to apply, in this case, for example, the use of apps like Mentimeter, so that we would have inputs from the participants on the scale they were going to give for potential criteria to do the pilot, but in anonymous ways, and also, grasp some of their considerations. So in the next slide, parting from this first exercise, we were able to define then the selected food losses and waste prioritization criteria. In our case, for example, food waste, as you can see, is a little bit below because we were not able to really conduct assessment in the case of food waste. And of course, same as Julia was saying, this was a very small case study. So any of the data we're going to be seeing here is very general and based from one observation, not actually a representative study. But in this case, there was a big focus on food losses, which is completely consistent with the aim of the Ministry of Agriculture. Since they explored the first steps of the food chain, then it was of course, obvious we were going to work mostly with food losses. So from the different criteria suggested in the guide, these are the ones that were selected for the pilot in Costa Rica, and they were based on the different considerations, expertise, data availability, which is something very important for MAG for each of these cases, and they evolved in time. So for example, of course, climate events were very important because of the region we were located, as well as food safety, because many of the products are used for exports. So food safety standards in the international markets are going to be quite strict. But for example, the MAG and food loss and waste capacity criteria evolved first from the consideration of MAG being able to access the farms, but then realizing that since they were focusing on small farmers, it was even more important to have capacity building within the MAG extension agents, which was something that was completely perceived, how they were improving time by time in their expertise in food losses and waste. So in the next slide, we can see some of the crops, that we wanted to work with potentially. These were some of the promising value chains. We did some preliminary assessments here, and then we started identifying which were possible to be assessed during this pilot or not, because, for example, the process might take too long. Let's say cacao, in order to get processed, we needed like a couple of weeks just to go through the fermentation process. So it was potentially not possible to be addressed during the pilot. But what we were able to do, as we can see in the pictures in the next slide, was also to bring up a whole bunch of different participatory tools into the application of the guide. So since our group was a bit bigger, we had like 20 participants at some point. What we did was that we divided the group into sub-teams, and these teams were able to have one-on-one discussions, then group discussions, also to vote, as you can see in some of the pictures, to understand, for example, which criteria were going to be of a higher priority, and therefore it allowed us to give weights to the different criteria and also identify and build up by themselves the different indicators that would be used to measure then each of the criteria for each of the selected crops. So one of the outputs, for example, in the next slide, is what we can see as the preliminary prioritization matrix. I'm not going to go through all the numbers, but the important thing to see here is that both at the end, the group was divided into teams. So they both made a preliminary assessment of the supply chains. And therefore, we can see 2 columns of numbers per each criteria. This was very useful in order to, bring up the discussion on why they were assessing differently the same crop and for the same criteria. So this told us a lot of things about how certain the data was, what was needed, what gaps we were finding, and even we were able, as you can see in some dots in the upper part of this matrix, we were able to have the MAG extension agents assessing actually the certainty and the availability of the data for each criteria. So for example, you can see red dots in seguridad alimentaria or food security, which was one of the criteria that was quite hard at some point to bring this concept into an actual indicator. So this means that further study and further research needs to be done in those. In others, it was in green, so that means there was enough available information. So moving towards the next slide, where we began the data collection process, you can see just some red flags mentioning the 12 different spots we visited. Some were processing plants, packing houses, or farms. And in the next slide, we can begin seeing some of the first images of what the value chains assessment was. So this is the case of plantain. And in the next slide, we can see the specific steps we're taking from the moment that the plantain is harvested in the farm and until it reaches the market. So in this case, we were able to estimate approximately a 10% rejected product, especially in the packing house. We were told that there was, and we were able to see that there was very little produce lost at the farm, but it was mostly detected some damages or some conditions at the packing house. And then depending on the market, it'll go, sometimes the plantain would be fresh, either ripe or green, because it can be eaten in both ways, or it can also have some further value adding. So it would be peeled, for example, and sent to the international market for having some sort of chips made out of plantain. In these cases, sometimes also losses can occur here because of excessive trimming or excessive peeling. In the next slide, we can see also a picture popped up here because sometimes the plantain can come from indigenous territories. So this will be adding one additional step, potentially also causing more losses, because the plantain would have to go through a river to get to the loading truck. So in these cases, sometimes accidents can happen in the river, plantain can be lost in the water, or again, some additional manipulation would suppose some additional potential damage as well. So going towards the next slide, perhaps one of the most important here things to mention here in the plantain case is the fact that this region is very vulnerable to floods, and this is something that occurred the last year. So when the flood happens, practically all the plants died, so the farmers would sow again all at the same time. This would cause concentration of the harvest at some moment of the year, and you know that most of the time when there is a lot of supply, then also buyers become much more pickier, if we could use that word. So they will be selecting obsessively the plantain, and some would be left in the field because they are not complying with some standard that might not even be official. In the next slide, we can start with the papaya case. So we were able again to visit the farms, see some of the operations, and in the next slide we can see the specific steps that we would be taking at the farm level and also at the packing house level. So in this case, farmers would be picking the papaya by hand when it is ready and ripened. It'll be loaded into the truck that could be from the same community, or the farmer would have the truck, and then it will arrive at a packing house that is part of their own association. So here that cooperative or the associative scheme was very important to see how they try to redirect sometimes the papaya that would have some potential damage, perhaps for the international market, but it'll still be useful for the local market. This is why we see that at the packing house, we practically only encountered 1% food loss. But if we go to the next slide, I can explain a little bit further that 15% that we could potentially find of losses at the farm. So these are some of the reasons for losses. On one case, we can find different physiological disorders that would cause different shapes in the papaya, that it's not closing well when the fruit is being formed. So in these cases, sometimes papaya would be rejected either from international markets for sure, and sometimes even for national markets. In the other hand, there could be some types of diseases causing the papaya not to be able to be eaten. Then in some other cases, papaya can come from hermaphrodite, male or female flowers. So in the case of the rounded papaya, you can see there that comes from a female flower, which is something that the market doesn't like for fresh products. So if there is a lot of papaya in the market, this is not going to be even picked up from the field. And potentially one risk that the value chain is encountering is the fact that styrofoam has been banned in Costa Rica, and the covering that you see in the last picture on the right is made of styrofoam to avoid damages between papayas. So this is something that we definitely need to move towards more research in order to substitute for this material, because if not, we can be encountering more damages. So going a little bit faster in the cassava case, if we can go to the next slide, we can see the operations actually taking place at the farm level. So in here, we were able to see that approximately 12% of the cassava is left in the field specifically. And in more detail, the next slide would tell us in which of the operations. So particularly when the cassava is hand-picked and cut from the rest of the tree or the bush that is formed, we can see that percentage of loss, because sometimes it could be broken, it can be excessively cut again, or it could be too small or too damaged in order to reach the market. So we applied here a very simple method, which was an observation 10 times repeated of 1 square meter of the field, and we tried to count how many cassava was left there, and then we weighted that in order to make an extra or a calculation of what we would have in the field, arriving to that approximate of 12%. If we move in the next slide to the packing house, we can see that there is less loss, 3%, but especially in more detail in the next slide, we can see that it usually happens whether it's in the operation of selection, because some damages are detected there, or as you can see in the pictures, because we can see damages that can happen either at the field and are only detected at the packing house, or even through some of the operations. For example, cassava is covered with a layer of paraffin to prolong its shelf life, but it has to shift from, let's say, room temperature to heat and then back to room temperature. These changes in heat can produce that cassava to crack, to excessively peel, and these can begin oxidation processes that would result in that 3%. Also, size and some other quality standards would be causing that type of waste. In the next slide, I just will try to wrap up here with some of the final activities we carried out. So for example, we did focus groups to conduct a value chain mapping and understand some other information. And these, in the next slide, these value chain maps were very useful, so that in the validation workshop, we were able to put that around the room. The participants were able to go and also give us their feedback, whether validating data or telling us we were missing something, or we should reconstruct some part of the value chain as it was drawn. So in this case, we were able to get a final an updated prioritization matrix, like we can see in the next slide. And here we have like the complete information. So we were able to see that at least for this case, and with the data we were able to withdraw, plantain and cassava, yucca, were the top 2 priority value chains to keep addressing in this context in order to tackle food losses and waste in the future. We also were able, as we can see in the next picture, to have a final session with the extension agents where they were able to provide their inputs on what they thought about the guide, what they thought about the data collection tools, in general, the whole experience. And it was very interesting to see how keen they were to also adapt technology into the data collection processes. So they mentioned that having these on already apps or online questionnaires would be very useful to later process data. As Julia mentioned in the next slide, I'm not going to detain myself a lot here, but we were able to have a collaboration, learning and adaptation workshop so that we can understand better also who can MAC be collaborating with in the future to continue working with food losses and waste. And it was very satisfactory to see also how they were having much more expertise at this point, and also how interested they were also in to share this with other regions from MAC, moving towards the with that region to the other ones. So final comments from the core team, and this is almost a transcript. Both Yendri and Francini said this pilot allowed them to validate the tool, the guide, and it helped them to select value chains based on identification, measurement, and a better understanding on food losses and waste, so that in the future, they can start thinking of possible solutions, prioritize agricultural products to be studied, and identify better where to invest in food losses and waste reduction efforts. And from key takeaways from our team also, we definitely understand, as we can see here, that this guide is an opportunity to raise food losses and waste awareness, both in technicians and in the farmers in the field. It was a chance to highlight strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and interests from the different actors of the value chain. And also, it was definitely a very organized but yet flexible tool in order to start studying more in-depth food losses and waste. So I finish here with this section, and I hand the floor to Paige. Thank you very much, all.
Thank you very much, Laura and Julie, for that detailed presentation, helping us understand your experiences in piloting the tool in the field. That was really excellent. We have here a link to the guide and toolkit. As we mentioned at the beginning, all of these resources have been made available on a Climate Links webpage. We can drop that in the chat so that everybody has access to it, and it will also be sent out again in a thank you email that will be coming after this webinar wraps up, with a recording as well of this webinar. So with that, we can open it up to some questions. Let me get to chat box. We have a few questions. I know it's about the top of the hour. We are planning to go for about another 15 minutes. And so we'll post some questions. Please feel free to continue dropping them in the chat box. I'd like to start by asking Agribusiness Associates, Rashmi and Julia, just your overall thoughts on the pilot and what you found striking to you during the implementation experience. And I asked that question particularly in the context of having originally developed the guide in 2020 and then being able to pilot it in 2022. Was there anything in the piloting experience that ended up being quite different when implementation was going on than what you had originally envisioned?
I can go first. Just for, as context, when we created the guide, a lot of it came from the work that I'd done in conducting value chain selection for a USAID funded project. It was a 5-year project. It was the first year we were just, starting out with crop selection, and we already had the funds to invest in these crops. So it came from a very, project background, but then we were able to go out and test it with an export association and with Ministry of Agriculture in Costa Rica. And so we were kind of delighted to see that it does work in different contexts with different types of institutions. So we really tried to keep it such that it is adaptable. Julie.
Yeah, I think especially with 2020, we saw just how much of it could be done remotely as needed. So both with Costa Rica and I think in Kenya I was in person for that food loss waste objective setting session, but in Costa Rica we were able to do it via Zoom earlier. And so you start to see what has to be done in person, some flexibility in what can be done online. And honestly, just constantly reiterating, like we've given kind of a structure and a format to the process, but so much of that is flexible. So with Kenya, we actually had them doing all the identifying of their value chains before we got there, and that gave them more time to look at it and pull statistics. And so we try to present it in this logical way, but depending on your organization, how much time you have, what you can get to at different phases, you can really kind of pick and choose or kind of mold it to your organization, especially if you already have a value chain selection process, just incorporating certain elements of this into that.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And let me see, we have some questions in the chat. Julia mentioned that herbs are hard to find data for food loss and waste. Is this the same for spices?
Good question. I didn't, that's a good question. I didn't look up spices for these specific projects. I don't know. I assume so, but I'll have to look it up.
Perhaps an area for future research.
Definitely.
We have a question also from Kai Robertson. Did you find that the growers themselves were interested in the data collection for their own business management purposes or otherwise?
Laura, do you want to take this one?
Sure. I think we can share perhaps from both cases. In the Costa Rican case, I believe that there is a growing interest into this. In the moments where we were able to talk directly to farmers, they were very interested in, trying to see what was the outcome. Sometimes, actually, one of the farmers, he even had some data and an insight of the potential effects that these food losses were causing, because he's also part of an association. So he also grasped part of even the social effects that this could be having. Although this was not assessed during this time, I think they are beginning to understand much more. They are concerned. Perhaps they don't have these specific names of food losses and waste or post-harvest losses, but they definitely understand this is causing problem to their operation and therefore interested in moving towards the solutions for it.
Yeah, and I think we saw similar in Kenya. Some of the farmers was interesting just because they're not the smallholder farmers, they're kind of medium scale farmers, and some of them were having issues. And it was really interesting for FPC to kind of get to do that level of work, because then the response from the farmers was just the appreciation of like, thank you for coming in, hearing our problems and wanting to offer some sort of help and like working with us as an industry. So it was fun to see those connections between the farmers and the different stakeholders. And some of those larger farmers were present at the validation workshop, and they really just continued to bring in some great insights and some really unique and innovative solutions from their perspective. So that was good to see too.
Great, thank you. Another question we have is for the implementation team, where would you see the greatest challenges in food loss and waste mitigation and reduction, just generally based on your implementation experience? And I guess on the flip side of that, any opportunities or lowest hanging fruit, or is it all very context specific and of course specific to the value chain as well?
I think definitely specific to the value chain. I think I really liked FPC's approach of looking at one domestic product and one export product, because then we just saw like if it's a product produced for export that's not very popular domestically, you're going to start seeing a lot more rejections for sprays because you have different rules, but you also just have fewer alternative markets because everything is, and the high perishability has a massive impact too. Of green beans only being good for a couple of days without refrigeration, whereas maybe a tomato can last a little bit longer out at a shelf. But I think a lot of the losses are different. I think one of the things we realized too was the cultural farming practices have the impact on harvest. So with green beans, you have to irrigate the day before you pick them, because if you don't, then they end up drying a lot in the process and you lose a lot more. So one day we're on the farm and he was like, on Mondays when we pick, we have more loss because nobody's there on Sunday to irrigate. which was fascinating.
Interesting finding. Okay, we have a couple of questions in the chat from Otto Gonzalez, who is the senior director of the division in which this pilot project was operating over the last year. Otto, thanks for joining. His first question is regarding the operationalizing of the guide. Can you give the guide to an organization or ministry or business stakeholder, what have you, and they just use it on their own? Or is it necessary to have a trained outside facilitator to manage that process?
I'm going to also ask Laura to speak on this because we developed the guide and then I got to kind of test it and pilot it in Kenya. And then we got the kit ready and we have a pilot within a pilot where we then just kind of gave the guide to Laura and to see, and then have meetings as we needed to fill in information. So from your perspective, Laura, how was?
I believe the guide is quite useful, and as we were trying to say in our final comment, it's organized but yet flexible. So this means that it'll definitely give an orientation to the organization that might use it on how to conduct it. Perhaps, of course, at some point, some expertise might be needed. First, perhaps on some concepts. However, the toolkits that are also within those and the ones that we used with the extension agents, I think that could clarify, for example, to bring everyone on the same definition on food loss and food waste. So that is very useful. And then the rest of the expertise, in my opinion, would have to be more like context-based. So the organization surely can reach either local or within the company. They can have also perhaps agronomists who would give some insights on why this is being lost or not, or some administrative person also understanding what is the process and the logistics. So I think that by, given just a little bit of study and some competences in the field or in the area that you're working with, I think it's possible to apply the guide practically on your own, talking about an organization or a ministry. Of course, there are local also professionals around who can always be reached, and that is also one of the best things about food losses and waste. Being so multidisciplinary and so multifactorial, you need to reach also for other people around.
Yeah, I want to speak a bit to
go
that.
ahead.
I do think that an organization can do it on their own, but you really need to identify the facilitator and have them take ownership of, facilitating the whole process. And then this person should ideally be an agronomist with a good understanding of food loss and waste. And as long as you have a strong facilitator, you can do it on your own. Yeah.
Great. Thank you for those thoughts. And Otto's second question is interesting. If I'm understanding it correctly, I think is asking about sort of like a cost benefit analysis and whether that is part or could be part of the guide. And if the process does include or could include considering the costs associated with reducing food loss and waste versus the cost of the food loss and waste itself, the economic losses of that lost food versus what it would cost to invest into mitigating those losses. Is that something that was considered?
Yeah, so we've definitely done this work in the past in other projects where every time we look at a specific intervention, we've looked at, what the cost of it is versus, how much it's saving and essentially how quickly the intervention will be paid off. So for example, when we did crates in Rwanda, I think we estimated that it will be paid back in, say 5 to 10 uses or something like that. I think it's pretty easy to do that kind of calculation, and it should be done. We don't really have that in the guide because we don't get into the interventions per se, but yes, definitely advise people to do that. At a certain point though, I think there's this idea of, how low can losses go? Like maybe once they're down to 3% or 1%, it may start getting really hard to have that intervention payback. Yeah. But maybe in a closed system, it's possible. Yeah.
Sure. Thank you for those insights. Okay, a little bit of time left for a couple of questions. In the case of Kenya, the Kenya pilot, one of the criteria that was chosen by FPC Kenya was willingness of members to invest directly. And I was wondering if that is related to willingness to invest in what is seen as a high value product for a high paying export market, or for other reasons, being just interest in consuming it domestically or noticing that a particular product has growing demand in a domestic market.
Yeah, 100% where the more valuable the product, kind of the more they're willing to invest. And I think that also draws in a little bit of Otto's aspects of that return of on your investment. So definitely that's in the matrix, kind of identifying like mangoes were high value, avocados are high value, green beans. And that's what the interesting part where we started to see the herbs come, because that wasn't something that had crossed FPC's mind. But then the pack house is like, no, it's a really high quality product. And so it's a high value product, even if it's not large in quantity. And it's also the growth of that industry. I think tomatoes, as long as they were doing some sort of regional export, and you can get a little bit more flexibility when you do greenhouse. So from that perspective, we saw some people willing to invest, but also there's so much competition in that market that you start to see, you really do have to draw from one of those guides of 100 ways to reduce food loss and waste for less than $100 solutions.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
So our time is coming to a close. Before we wrap up, I would like to give a few special shout outs and word of thanks to a number of different groups and individuals who are really helpful. I'd like to give a shout out to our FAS team, our agency's posts in both Nairobi and San Jose, for their great support and direction throughout the piloting of both locations. Those teams were respectively very involved in the setup and facilitation of these pilots taking place on location. So thank you very much to Ryan Scott, Matt Snyder, and Kennedy Gitonga in the Kenya Nairobi-based team, and in San Jose, Costa Rica. Thank you to Evan Mangino and Victor Gonzalez. I'd also like to thank very much the team and the Extension Officer team as well in the Ministry of Agriculture and Livestock in Costa Rica for your support, and for the ministry's willingness and interest in accepting and participating in this project. We really appreciated that perspective. And I'd like to thank Laura and Ava as well for your support in carrying out the project, and also the input you had into everything in designing all of the resources. Thank you so much. Thank you as well to the FPC Kenya team for their time and participation. And finally, of course, thank you very much to the Agribusiness Associates team for doing all of this amazing and important work. And thank you to all of our participants today. It was great to have such a strong showing during this presentation. We will share, as I had mentioned in a follow-up email, link to this recording, as well as a link to the Climate Links webpage, where all of this information is available to be downloaded. So again, thank you very much, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your days.
Thank you, Paige.
Thank
Thanks.
you. Bye.
Thank you.